"There are 4 of you," the man said. "4 rounds," the woman answered. "I've made harder shots with my eyes half shut." The lantern threw one cold gleam across the storage room. 4 armed men, 1 woman with a market basket. Nobody moved. Then the man nearest the door shifted his weight, just slightly. Just 1 inch. She'd seen that shift 1,000 times before. She was all ready when the first shot fired, then the second. 2 men down. 3 seconds, the third ran. He didn't make it. Fourth, the smart one grabbed a crate and shoved it at her hard. She sidestepped. He reached for his gun. He was fast. Not fast enough. 4 dangerous men walked into that room that night. None of them walked out. Here's what nobody in the town of Redstone knew. The woman who did this sold eggs at the market every Thursday morning. Who was Ruth Calloway? Really? And what did her dead husband leave behind that was worth killing for? Sheriff Desmond Pruitt had seen a lot of bad mornings in his life. He'd seen drought kill a whole season's crops overnight. He'd seen a man die from a snake bite 3 steps from his own front door. He'd seen floods take houses, fires take families' biz, and time take everything else. But he had never walked into a saloon at 7 in the morning and counted 4 dead men before he'd finished his first cup of coffee. The Dusty Spur was quiet. That was the first wrong thing. The Dusty Spur was never quiet. Even at this hour, Gus Lorne would be behind the bar, wiping down glasses, humming something off-key to himself. There'd be the smell of yesterday's whiskey and wood smoke, and maybe 1 or 2 old-timers nursing a drink in the corner because they had nowhere else to be. This morning there was none of that, just silence. And 4 men on the floor stood in the doorway for a long moment. His hand rested on the frame. He wasn't afraid exactly. He was something worse than afraid. He was confused, and in his experience, confusion in a room full of dead men was never a good sign. He stepped inside. The first man was near the bar. Face down. Big fellow, broad through the shoulders. His right hand was still reaching toward his holster. He hadn't made it. The second was by the window. He'd managed to get his gun out. It was on the floor beside him, unfired. Whatever had happened, it happened fast. Faster than this man had expected. The third and fourth were together near the back table. They'd moved toward each other in those last seconds. Maybe for cover. Maybe just out of instinct. The way men move toward other men when they're frightened, it hadn't helped. Pruitt crouched beside the nearest body and looked at the wound. Small entry. Clean. He stood up slowly. He looked around the room again. No broken glass. No overturned chairs. No signs of a struggle or a chase. Whoever had done this had done it quickly and quietly, and then walked out the door like it was nothing. On the back table, the one near the corner, there was a single cup of tea, cold now, barely touched, and beside it, folded neatly like it had been left on purpose, was a worn cotton handkerchief. Old. Washed so many times the embroidery on the corner had nearly faded to nothing. He picked it up carefully. 2 letters remained visible in the stitching R. C. Pruitt stood there holding that handkerchief for a long time. Then he set it down, walked back to the door, and looked out at Redstone's main street. The town was just starting to wake up. A woman was hanging laundry across the way. A dog nosed around near the feed store. Nobody knew yet. He had maybe an hour before they did. He pulled the door shut behind him and stood onto the porch, thinking about a woman he'd avoided saying good morning to at the market yesterday. "What did you do, Ruth?" Thought about that for a long moment. Then he went to find out. The morning had started the way Ruth Calloway's mornings always started. Before the sun was fully up, she didn't need a clock. Hadn't needed one in 30 years. Her body knew when it was time, and it woke her with the same quiet insistence every single day. No fanfare, no warmth, just the simple fact of consciousness arriving before the light did. She dressed in the dark, practical clothes always, a heavy skirt, worn soft with age, a blouse with the sleeves she could roll up when the work demanded it, boots that had been resoled twice and would need it a third time before winter. She went to the kitchen, built the fire, set the water to boil. Outside, the land was still gray and cool. The Calloway farm wasn't much to look at, especially at this hour. 20 acres, a modest house, a barn that needed its roof patched before the rains came back, a vegetable garden on the south side, a chicken yard to the east, and nothing a stranger would look at twice. That was the thing about this place. It had never asked to be looked at twice. It had only ever asked to be worked. Ruth had worked it. She'd worked it when Jim was alive, and they'd worked it together. And she'd worked it in the 3 years since he passed, alone, because what else was there to do? You didn't stop because someone was gone. The land didn't stop needing water. The chickens didn't stop needing feed. Time didn't stop moving forward just because you weren't sure you wanted it to. She poured her tea, sat at the kitchen table, and that's when she saw it. The folded piece of paper was sitting on the table, right there between her teacup and the salt shaker. She hadn't put it there. She was certain of that, the way you're certain of things in your own home, the way you know exactly which floorboard creaks and which drawer sticks. Someone had come in during the night. She didn't pick it up right away. She looked at it for a moment, just sat with the fact of it. An uninvited thing in her kitchen, on her table, in the house she'd locked before she went to sleep. Then she reached over and unfolded it. The handwriting was not familiar to her. Neat, deliberate, the kind of writing that wanted to look calm even if the hand holding the pen was not. We know what Jim left behind. Come to the Dusty Spur tonight, 7 o'clock, alone. If you don't, the farm won't be standing by morning. She read it twice. Then she set it down on the table and looked out the window at the gray light coming up over the east field. Jim, when 3 years gone, and they were still coming for what he'd left behind, whatever that was. He hadn't told her everything. She'd known that in the way wives know things, not from words, but from silences, from the way he'd sometimes stop in the middle of a sentence and look at her like he was deciding how much to say. He'd always decided too little. There are things I haven't told you, Ruth. If something happens to me, don't trust anyone in this town, not even Pruitt. That was the last real conversation they'd had. 3 days before he died. She'd thought about those words every day since. She folded the note back up and put it in her pocket. Then she finished her tea, rinsed her cup, and went to the bedroom. She pulled the small wooden chest out from under the loose floorboard in the corner. She'd kept it there since Jim passed, not entirely sure why. Some instinct she hadn't questioned. Inside was his pistol. It was a Colt single-action army, .45 caliber. Not a small gun, not a delicate gun. Jim had bought it when they first settled on the farm, said every man ought to have one in this country. But Jim had never been the shot his wife was. He hadn't known that when they married. She hadn't told him right away. She wasn't sure at first how he'd take it. A woman who could outshoot any man she'd ever met. That wasn't something most men knew what to do with. But Jim had been different. When he found out, he hadn't been unsettled. He'd watched her put 5 shots through a tin can at 100 yards, and then he'd laughed and said, "Lord, Ruth, who are you?" And she'd said, "Just a farmer's wife." And he'd said, "No, you're something else entirely." She took the pistol from the chest now and turned it over in her hands. The metal was cold, a little dusty. She hadn't held it since Jim's funeral, when she'd put it away and told herself she was done with that part of her life. Jim had understood that. Said it to her once, in a different context, and she hadn't fully understood what he meant at the time. Nobody really leaves behind the thing they were born to do. It just waits. She checked the cylinder, loaded it carefully, 1 round at a time. She knew how to do this the way she knew how to knead bread dough or red weather in the color of the sky, without thinking, without hesitation. She put the pistol at the bottom of the market basket, under a folded piece of burlap. Then she picked up her egg crates, called the chickens back into the yard, and walked out to hitch the wagon. It was going to be a long day. The town of Redstone, Texas sat at the edge of the hill country like something that had stopped moving and then forgotten to start again. It wasn't a bad town. It had a church, a school, a general store, a blacksmith, a bank, a land office, and the Dusty Spur Saloon, which did more business than the church and the school combined, depending on the week. About 400 people called it home, which was enough to make it feel like a real place, and not enough to make you feel anonymous in it. Ruth knew most of them by name. She sold her eggs and her extra chickens at the weekly market, the same stall she'd been running since she and Jim arrived 20 years ago. She knew which families were struggling and which ones weren't. She knew who'd had a hard winter and who'd had a good harvest. She knew Mrs. Alderman's hip was giving her trouble and that old Henry Bauer had been drinking more since his wife passed. She knew Redstone the way you know a place you've built your life inside, which was why she noticed this afternoon the things that were wrong. 2 men she didn't recognize standing near the feed store entrance. Not shopping, just standing, watching the street. They had the look of men who were good at being invisible and knew it. Gus Lorne, who ran the Dusty Spur, was loading crates from a wagon out front. When Ruth passed, he looked up, met her eyes, and looked away again quickly. Gus wasn't an unfriendly man. He'd always had a word or two for her at market, but today he turned away like he hadn't seen her. And Sheriff Desmond Pruitt, he spotted him near the far end of the market, talking to a vendor. He saw her too, she was certain of it. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, and then he turned deliberately and walked the other direction. Don't trust anyone in this town. Not even Pruitt. She'd never fully understood what Jim meant by that. Pruitt had always seemed decent enough. Tired, maybe. A little beaten down by the years, but not corrupt. And yet here he was, looking away. She finished her selling, took her time about it, talked to the people she always talked to. She didn't rush, and she didn't look over her shoulder. If those two strangers near the feed store were watching her, she wasn't going to give them the satisfaction of knowing she'd noticed. She packed up her empty crates, hitched her wagon, and drove it to the livery at the edge of town. Left the horse and wagon there for the night, like she sometimes did when she had business to finish before heading home. Then she walked back toward the dusty spur. She still had 2 hours before 7 o'clock. She used them carefully. She walked through the alley beside the saloon, counted her steps, noted the layout. There was a back door that opened into a storage area. She'd seen deliveries come through it before. From the storage area, a narrow corridor led into the main room. If she stood at the end of that corridor, she could see the whole saloon floor without being seen herself. She noted the distance from the back table, the corner one, the one where she intended to sit, to the back exit. She noted the positions of the support posts. She noted the way the evening light came through the western windows and where it would leave shadows at 7 o'clock. You didn't spend 5 years as the featured sharpshooter of a traveling Wild West exhibition without learning to read a space. She'd spent those 5 years reading stages and show grounds and outdoor arenas across the American West, calculating distances and angles and light conditions before every single performance. She'd done it so many times it had become a reflex. A way of seeing. She saw it now. The dusty spur had one main entrance at the front, the back exit through the storage corridor, 2 windows on the western wall that could theoretically be opened, but were painted shut. Anyone coming through the front door would have the light behind them for about 20 minutes after 7. Anyone standing near the back would have the shadows in their favor. Good, she completed her circuit of the building, went back to the street and found a place to sit near the mercantile with a clear view of the saloon's front door. Then she waited. She was good at waiting. Better than most people expected, watching her. She had the stillness of someone who'd spent years learning that patience wasn't weakness. It was just accuracy practiced over time. At 5:30, 4 men arrived at the dusty spur. They came in 2 pairs, 10 minutes apart, which was smart. Less conspicuous that way. But she'd been watching, so she saw them both, big men, working men by the look of their clothes, but their eyes were wrong, alert in the wrong way, looking without looking like they were looking. And their boots, she noticed their boots. She'd spent enough time near enough kinds of men to know that a working man's boots showed his work. Farms had field mud, ranch hands had manure and dust, blacksmiths had soot, miners had a particular gray clay. These men's boots were dusty from road travel, nothing more. No field, no ranch, no shop. These men hadn't been working the land, they'd been traveling to get somewhere, they'd been traveling to get here. At 5:45, another man arrived alone. He was different from the others. He was older, for one thing. Mid-50s, lean in the way of a man who moved a lot and ate when he could. He wore a plain coat, trail-worn but clean. His hat was pulled low. But it was the way he moved that set him apart. Not the careful, controlled movement of a man trying to look relaxed, but the genuine economy of someone who'd spent a long time observing and very little time performing. He went inside. A minute later, she saw him through the window. He'd moved to a corner table. His back was to the wall. He'd taken in the room once, and then stopped looking around, which was how she knew he'd already seen everything he needed to see. She thought about that for a moment, then she picked up her market basket and walked toward the front door. Saloon was warm and low lit. There were maybe a dozen people inside, a few regulars at the bar, 2 men playing cards near the window, Gus Lorne moving behind the counter with the mechanical efficiency of a man who'd done this job for so many years that his body did it without his involvement. Ruth paused just inside the door and took stock. She found the 4 men immediately, split up, 2 at a table near the center, 1 at the bar, 1 near the front window. All of them had that same quality of waiting she'd noticed from outside. They were arranged, she realized, like men who'd been told where to stand, positioned like a stage set. She'd been on enough stages to know one. She also found the man from the corner table again. He was still there, still in the same position. His coffee cup was in front of him, and he was looking at nothing in particular, which meant he was looking at everything. Their eyes met briefly. She looked away first. Not out of discomfort, out of habit. In the exhibition, you never let the audience know what you were really watching. She went to the corner table at the back and sat down. She ordered tea from the young man who came to take her order, not whiskey, not coffee. Tea. She watched Gus note it from behind the bar and look away again too quickly. There it was again. That looking away, she kept her hands in her lap, fingers loose around the grip of the pistol through the burlap of her basket. Not gripping, just resting, waiting. At 7 o'clock exactly, one of the 4 men stood up and walked toward her table. He was the one who'd been near the window. Medium height, a hard, practiced face. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down without being invited, and he did it with the ease of a man who'd never needed an invitation to anything in his life. Wade Creel. She didn't know his name yet. She would learn it later. She knew his type. She'd met his type before in different clothes in different settings. Men who'd decided that other people existed primarily for their convenience. He put his hands flat on the table, no weapon visible, which didn't mean no weapon present. Spoke quietly, conversationally. Like they were 2 old friends catching up over drinks, Mrs. Calloway. Thank you for coming. I didn't have much choice, she said. Everyone has choices. He smiled. Some choices just have more consequences than others. She looked at him and said nothing. We'll keep this simple, he continued. Your husband left something behind when he died. Something that doesn't belong to him or to you. We'd like it back. In exchange, you go home tonight and you live your life, and nobody from our side of things ever contacts you again. What makes you think I know where it is? Because Jim was a careful man, Wade said. Careful men don't leave things to chance. Whatever he had, he made sure someone he trusted would know where to find it. And the only person Jim Calloway trusted was you. That was, Ruth thought, probably true. She looked at him for a long moment. She thought about Jim's hands in hers in those last days. She thought about the way he'd looked at her when he said, "Don't trust anyone." She thought about the way he'd pressed something small and folded into the lining of her winter coat 3 days before he passed. His fingers moving quickly, like he was trying to finish before he ran out of time. She'd found it 2 weeks after the funeral, putting the coat away for the season. A folded piece of paper, hand-drawn, with a mark on it she didn't recognize. She'd kept it. She hadn't known what it meant. She'd kept it. What exactly does Mr. Briggs think Jim left behind? She asked. Wade's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. A small recalibration, quickly concealed. He hadn't expected her to know the name. A lockbox, he said after a moment. And a ledger. And if I told you I don't know where either of those things are, then I'd tell you that we've been very patient, Mrs. Calloway. And that patience has limits. He leaned back. Your farm is 20 acres, give or take. A lot of space for accidents to happen, especially at night when there's no one to help. She held his gaze. She could feel the 4 other men, the ones he'd come in with, arranged around the room. She'd tracked them by sound and peripheral vision since the moment she sat down. She knew exactly where each of them was. She also knew where the man in the corner table was. She'd been aware of him the whole time. Hadn't looked at him directly. But she'd noticed, in the way you notice things without focusing on them, that he'd shifted slightly in his chair when Wade sat down. That his coffee cup hadn't moved in 10 minutes. He was listening. Good. All right, she said. Wade raised an eyebrow. All right? She said again. Take to it tonight. Now. Whatever Jim left, I'll take you to it. But I want something from you first. What's that? She reached into her basket and laid a piece of paper on the table. A letter, sealed. She'd written it that afternoon and addressed it to Pruitt's office. This goes to the sheriff unopened. After we're done. That's my condition. Wade looked at the letter. She watched him calculate. He was wondering what was in it. He was wondering if it mattered. He was deciding whether she was negotiating or stalling. He took the letter and pocketed it. Fine, he said. After we're done, he stood. He gestured to the other men with a movement so slight she almost missed it. She stood too. She picked up her basket. She walked toward the back of the saloon, toward the corridor that led to the storage room, toward the back door she'd already measured. She heard them follow. She heard, also, the soft scrape of a chair in the far corner. The man in the worn coat had stood up. The storage room behind the dusty spur was maybe 20 feet square. It smelled of sawdust and old whiskey, and the particular dry mustiness of a space that stored things people weren't ready to throw away yet. Broken chairs stacked in one corner. Crates of empty bottles along the south wall. A workbench along the east wall with tools hanging above it, one overhead lantern burning low, one door in from the saloon corridor, one door out to the alley. Ruth knew both of them. She walked to the center of the room and stopped. The 4 men came in behind her. Wade first, then the others. The door from the corridor swung shut behind the last one. 5 men in a closed room. She stood with her back to the workbench and turned to face them. Wade looked around the room. This isn't outside, he said. No, she agreed. It isn't. You said you'd take us to it. I said I'd take you somewhere, she said. This is it. She reached into the basket, and the pistol came up in one clean, practiced movement. For a moment, nobody moved. The lantern light caught the metal of the gun and threw a small cold gleam across the room. Ruth stood with her feet planted, her grip steady, the way she'd stood for 5 years on stages from Kansas City to San Francisco. There are 4 of you, Wade said. His voice was still calm. He was working through the numbers the way dangerous men do. 1 gun? 4 rounds, Ruth said. I've made harder shots with my eyes half shut. That's not possible. She looked at him. You hired 4 men to frighten a farm widow who sells eggs at the market, she said. And now you're telling me what's possible. The man nearest to her on the left shifted his weight. That was the tell. She'd seen that shift 1,000 times on the exhibition circuit. Before the fast draw competition at the Cheyenne show, she'd watched 47 different men make that same small weight transfer a fraction of a second before they reached for their gun. A body telegraphs what the mind decides. You just have to know the language. She knew the language. She turned 45 degrees to the left and fired. The sound in the small room was enormous. The man on the left went down before his hand had fully closed around his holster. The second man, the one by the east wall, was already moving, but she was already turning, and the second shot found him with the clean efficiency of a skill that had never left her, only waited. 2 down, 2 shots. Elapsed time, less than 3 seconds. The third man ran for the door to the alley. He made it 2 steps. Fourth, Wade did something smarter than the others. He didn't reach for his weapon. He grabbed an empty crate from the stack near the south wall and shoved it toward her. Hard, trying to break her footing, she sidestepped. The crate hit the workbench behind her. Wade went for his gun. He was fast. Genuinely fast, faster than the others. In another situation against another person, it would have been enough. Ruth shot him in the shoulder and he went down hard. He didn't get up. She stood over him for a moment. He was breathing, barely conscious. His gun hand was useless now, the shoulder destroyed by the shot. She looked at the 3 men on the floor of that storage room. 2 would not be getting up again. Ever Wade Creel would live, but he would never use that right hand again. Not to draw. Not for anything that required strength or precision. Whatever he'd been before he walked into this room, that version of him was finished. She looked at the young man face down near the alley door. Stay down, she said, and you'll see morning. He stayed down. She stood in the center of the room and listened to the silence. None of them had walked out. The third man had made it to the alley door, but it had stuck, swollen in the frame from the season, and he'd lost the 2 seconds he needed scrabbling with the handle. By the time he wrenched it open, she was behind him. Stop, she said. He stopped. He turned slowly, hands going up. A young man, she saw now, younger than she'd thought inside. Maybe 25. He was breathing hard. Face had the particular expression of someone who'd just understood, completely and for the first time, that they had made a serious error in judgment. On the floor, she said. Face down. Hands behind your back. He went down without another word. The alley was quiet. The night air was cool. From behind her, she heard a sound in the doorway, the measured sound of someone stepping carefully over a threshold. She turned. The man in the worn coat was standing in the corridor doorway. He'd come through from the saloon. He looked at the room, at the 2 men down, at Wade against the wall pressing his hand to his shoulder, at the young man face down on the floor near the alley. He looked at her. She lowered the gun but didn't put it away. You were at the corner table, she said. I was. What are you doing back here? He was quiet for a moment, like he was deciding how to answer that honestly. I don't entirely know, he said. I followed because it seemed like the thing to do. I wasn't sure you needed help. I didn't, she said. No, he said. You didn't. He looked around the room again, slowly, taking inventory the way a man does when he's trying to understand something that doesn't quite fit into the categories he's built for himself. I've been doing this kind of work for 20 years, he said finally. Finding people. Watching situations. He paused. I've never watched what I just watched. Ruth set her basket down on the workbench. I used to perform, she said. Wild West exhibition. 10 years back before I married. 10 years, he said. I was the featured sharpshooter for 5 of them. He nodded slowly, like something was settling into place. Your husband, he said. Jim Calloway? She looked at him directly for the first time. You know that name. It wasn't a question. He met her eyes. In the low lantern light, she could see that he was a man who'd been carrying something heavy for a long time, not physical weight. The other kind. The kind that settles into the lines of a face and doesn't leave. I know that name, he said, and I think you and I need to have a conversation. Outside, Redstone was going about its evening business. Nobody had heard the shots. The thick walls of the storage room and the noise of the saloon had swallowed them whole. In the alley, the night air smelled of dust and coming autumn. Ruth picked up her basket. "All right," she said, "but you go first." They went back into the saloon. There was no one left inside. The regulars had cleared out sometime during the last hour. Gus Lorne had seen to that, Ruth suspected, before he disappeared himself. The bar was empty. The lanterns were burning low. The card game by the window had been abandoned mid-hand, coins still on the table. Ruth walked behind the bar, found the coffee pot on the stove, and checked if there was anything left in it. There was. She poured 2 cups without asking and set them on the nearest table. He sat down. Everett Shaw sat across from her. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The silence wasn't uncomfortable exactly. It was the silence of 2 people who understood that what came next mattered and didn't want to rush it. Ruth looked at him carefully in the better light, mid-50s. Gray at the temples, more gray than dark now. A face that had spent a lot of time outdoors and showed it. His hands resting on the table were the hands of a man who'd done physical work but also careful work. The knuckles were scarred, but the fingers were precise. His eyes were the thing, though. She'd noticed them earlier, and she noticed them again now. There was a quality in them she recognized, though she couldn't have named it easily. It was the quality of someone who had looked at a great many things and made a habit of seeing them clearly, even when clearly wasn't comfortable. She'd known one other person with eyes like that. Jim, in his last year. "You said you know the name," she said. "Jim Calloway, yes. From where?" Shaw wrapped both hands around his coffee cup. He looked at it for a moment before answering. 7 years ago, he said, "I was working for the Pinkerton National Detective Agency, based out of the Kansas City office. I'd been with them 15 years by that point." Ruth said nothing. She waited. In the spring of 1872, a bank in Abilene was robbed. Not a small job, organized, well-planned, clearly inside knowledge of the bank's schedule and security. $47,000. Nobody was killed, which was notable. The men who did it were professionals, and Jim was one of them? Shaw looked at her directly. "No," he said. "Jim wasn't one of the men who did it. He was one of the men who knew who'd planned it." Ruth's hands were still around her coffee cup. She didn't move them. "What does that mean?" she said. "It means," Shaw said carefully, "that the robbery wasn't just a robbery. There was a man behind it. Someone with money and influence who used other people to do the actual work, then took the lion's share of the proceeds and disappeared back into respectability. Happens more than people think. The men with rough hands get caught. The men with clean hands don't. And Jim knew who the man with the clean hands was. Jim had worked for him," Shaw said. "Not in the robbery itself. In the infrastructure, you might say. Moving money, keeping records, making things look legitimate on paper. He wasn't alone. There were several men who filled that role. But Jim was the only one who'd kept records of his own private accounting of what he'd done, and for whom and when." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and went silent. "He never told me any of this," she said. "I know. How do you know?" "Because if you'd known," Shaw said, "you'd have done something about it before now. And because the Jim Calloway I read about in those files was a man who was trying very hard to protect someone." She looked at him. "When I was assigned to the Abilene case," he continued, "I spent 8 months tracking the money, following the chain back from the men who'd done the work to the man who'd organized it. I got closer than anyone had gotten before." He paused. "And then someone burned my house down." Ruth went very still. "My wife," Shaw said. He said it the way you say something you've practiced saying, because the alternative is not being able to say it at all. "She was home. I wasn't. There was a fire. By the time anyone—" He stopped. Took a breath. "She didn't survive. The saloon was very quiet." "I'm sorry." Ruth said, "I left Pinkerton after that." He said, "Officially I was suspended for what they called unauthorized pursuit of leads. The truth is, I think they were afraid of what I'd do if I found the right man. And they weren't wrong to be afraid." "And the man you were looking for," Ruth said. "The man behind the robbery, you never found him?" "I found a name," Shaw said. "Or part of one, HB. That's what appeared in every piece of correspondence I recovered. 2 initials, never a full name. Whoever he was careful." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. "Harlan Briggs." She said Shaw didn't react the way she expected. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man hearing a key turn in a lock he'd been staring at for 7 years. "You're sure?" he said. "Jim said the name," she said. "Before he died, he said she stopped organizing the memory. He said he'd worked for Briggs once, that he'd been a fool, that Briggs was more dangerous than anyone in this county understood." "He was right," Shaw said. And you think Briggs had Jim killed? Shaw was quiet for a moment. I think Jim Calloway spent 10 years building a quiet life and hoping it was enough distance, he said. And I think at some point it wasn't. Yes, Ruth looked down at her coffee cup. She'd known. She'd known for 3 years, in the way you know things you don't have words for yet. The timing of Jim's illness, how fast it had moved, the way certain people in town had looked at her in the days after the funeral, not with grief exactly, but with a particular kind of careful watching. She'd known and she hadn't known what to do with the knowing. There's something else, she said. She reached into the collar of her blouse. Along the inside seam of the lining, stitched in with thread that didn't match, was a small paper packet. She'd sewn it there herself, 2 weeks after the funeral, when she'd found it in the lining of Jim's coat and understood, without fully understanding, that it needed to be somewhere close and somewhere hidden. She worked the stitching loose with her thumbnail and laid the folded paper on the table. Shaw looked at it but didn't touch it. Jim put that in his coat before he died, she said. I found it after. I've kept it because I didn't know what it was. I still don't. Not entirely, may I? She nodded. He unfolded it carefully. It was a hand-drawn diagram, lines, distances, a rough sketch of a landscape, and in the upper right corner a small symbol. 8 lines arranged in a particular pattern, precise and deliberate. Shaw looked at it for a long time. His expression changed. It was a subtle change. She watched it move through him like weather moving across a hillside. That symbol, he said. Do you know what that is? No. It's a Pinkerton location marker, he said. We use them for safe houses, for evidence drops, places where operatives left material they couldn't carry safely. Ruth looked at him. Jim used Pinkerton markers, she said slowly. Yes, Jim wasn't a Pinkerton man. Shaw folded the paper very carefully and set it back on the table between them. That, he said, is what I need to tell you. And I need you to prepare yourself, because it changes the shape of things considerably. He told her everything he knew. It took a while. He was careful about it, choosing words the way you choose footing on uncertain ground, testing each one before putting weight on it. He didn't soften it, but he didn't rush it either. He gave her time to absorb each piece before adding the next. Jim Calloway had been recruited by the Pinkerton Agency in 1869 not as a field agent, as a deep-cover operative, what the agency called an inside man. Someone placed within a criminal organization to gather information from the inside, slowly over months or years, without ever surfacing. It was dangerous work. It was also, by its nature, invisible work. The men who did it didn't appear in official Pinkerton rosters. They didn't have badges or salaries. They had contacts, code names, and the constant awareness that if something went wrong, the agency would have difficulty acknowledging they existed. Jim had been recruited because he had a particular talent. He was good with numbers, good with paperwork, and he had a manner that made people trust him. He didn't look like a threat. He didn't feel like a threat. He walked into rooms and made people comfortable, and comfortable people talked. Spent 2 years working his way into Harlan Briggs's financial operation. Moving money on paper. Keeping the books that made illegal income look like legitimate business. Learning the names, the amounts, the dates, the methods. And during those 2 years, he'd kept his own private record, a ledger. Detailed, meticulous, written in a personal shorthand only he could decode. Every transaction, every name, every instruction from Briggs, every delivery, every payment. 2 years of evidence carefully documented. When the Abilene robbery was planned, Jim had tried to get word to his Pinkerton contact, but the contact had been compromised. Somehow Briggs had learned there was a leak, though he hadn't yet identified who. The robbery went ahead. Jim couldn't stop it. What he could do was document it, add it to his ledger, and wait for an opportunity to get the ledger out. That opportunity never came. Briggs began tightening his circle, trusting fewer people, watching more carefully. Jim understood what it meant. He had weeks, maybe less, before Briggs found him. He ran. He took the ledger and a significant portion of the money he'd been trusted to move. Not to keep, but to use as evidence of the cash flow, and he disappeared. Changed his name, found a small farm in a town that wasn't on any map Briggs was likely to be looking at. Found a woman at a church social who sold eggs and had a laugh that made the whole room better and had no idea who he'd been or what he'd done. He married her. He built a life that was real and true and entirely his own, and he spent 11 years hoping it was far enough. Ruth sat with all of this for a long moment after Shaw finished. The lanterns in the saloon had burned lower. It was well past midnight now. Town outside was fully asleep. He lied to me, she said, not with anger. With something quieter and more complicated than anger, he built something real, Shaw said. Whatever he'd been before, what he had with you was real. I know that. she said. It's not what I meant. She looked at the table. I meant he carried all of this alone. For 20 years. He never let me. She stopped. Shaw was quiet. He thought he was protecting me, she said. Yes, and instead she exhaled. He just left me with a piece of paper I didn't understand and a farm full of people I couldn't trust and no idea why. The silence stretched. Then she said, "Where is the ledger now?" Shaw looked at the map on the table. "If I'm reading this correctly," he said, "it's about 12 miles west of here. There's a property marker in the upper left corner. That ridge formation. I know that terrain. I passed through it 2 days ago coming into Redstone. There's an abandoned farm out there," Ruth said. "The Hadley place. Nobody's worked it in years. That would fit." She looked at the map. At the mark Jim had made, so carefully for the last days of his life. He knew they were coming for him. She said, "Yes, and he made sure the evidence was somewhere they wouldn't find it without me. He made sure it was somewhere safe," Shaw said, "and he made sure you had the only key to finding it. Whether he told you that or not." Ruth looked at him. "You said something burned your house down," she said. 7 years ago. Yes, was that Briggs?" Shaw looked at her steadily. "My contact inside Briggs's operation identified HB as the source of the order," he said. "Someone talked to someone and the word came back." "Yes, so you've been looking for Briggs for 7 years." "I've been." He paused. "Drifting mostly. Looking sometimes. Mostly trying to figure out what I'd do if I actually found him, and now you have. And now," he said, "I find myself sitting across from a woman who just put 4 armed men on the ground in under 30 seconds. So perhaps the question of what I'd do is less urgent than I thought." For the first time since she'd sat down, Ruth almost smiled. "What do we do about the men in the storage room?" she said. "Wade Creel will survive if he gets attention," Shaw said. "The shoulder wound won't kill him. The other 3, he stopped." "I know," she said. "You don't owe me an explanation." "No," she agreed. "I don't." She looked at the table. "They would have killed me once they had what they wanted. Or kept coming until they did. Thought about this for 3 years, since Jim died. What I would do if they finally came." She was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't going to let them take anything else." Shaw nodded. There was nothing performative in it. No judgment in either direction. Just the acknowledgement of a person who'd made a clear-eyed decision and meant it. "We need to get to the Hadley place before Briggs realizes his men aren't coming back," he said. "How long do we have?" "He'll expect to hear from Wade by midnight. When he doesn't," Shaw looked toward the window. "It's past midnight now." Ruth stood up. She picked up her basket. She checked the pistol, reloaded the spent chambers from the rounds she kept in the small cloth pouch at the bottom of the basket, and put it back under the burlap. "I know a back way out of town," she said. "We can take the livery horses. Mine's already there." "You planned for this," Shaw said. "It wasn't quite a question. I planned for needing to leave quickly," she said. "I didn't plan for you." She walked toward the back of the saloon, toward the corridor, toward the storage room in the alley beyond it. Shaw followed. They rode without lamps. The moon was 3/4 full, and the sky was clear, which was enough light to navigate by if you knew the land. Ruth knew it. She'd ridden these roads in every season and every kind of weather for 20 years. She knew where the road dipped, and where it climbed, and where the creek crossing ran shallow enough to ford without trouble. Shaw rode beside her and kept quiet, which she appreciated. There is a particular kind of person who understands that silence on a nighttime road is not unfriendliness. It's just the right response to darkness and distance, and the particular quality of thought that long riding produces. Shaw seemed to understand that. He rode well, not showy, not stiff, like a man who'd spent a lot of time on horseback and made his peace with it. They covered the 12 miles in just under 2 hours. The Hadley place appeared at the edge of a low ridge, gray and shapeless in the moonlight. An old farmhouse, roofless now, the walls standing but the interior open to the sky. Beside it a barn in better shape, the roof still mostly intact, the doors hanging open on one side, and behind the barn a smaller structure. A storage shed maybe, low and dark. Ruth dismounted and tied her horse to the fence post at the property line. Shaw dismounted beside her. "The shed," she said, looking at the map one more time in the moonlight. The mark Jim had made corresponded to the position of that structure behind the barn. She was certain of it. They walked across the overgrown yard. The grass was knee-high and damp with dew. Something moved in the darkness near the old house. A rabbit probably, startled by their footsteps. The shed door was padlocked. Ruth looked at the padlock. It was old, but it was solid. She looked at Shaw. He reached into his coat pocket and produced a small leather roll. He unfolded it on his knee, selected 2 thin tools from the interior, and went to work on the lock. "You learned that at Pinkerton?" she said. Among other places, he said. The lock opened in less than a minute. Inside, the shed was dark and dry and smelled of old hay and metal. Shaw produced a small lantern from his saddlebag. He'd brought it from the livery without explaining why, and lit it. Turning the wick low, the light spread across the interior of the shed. In the far corner, under a section of old floorboard marked with a small deliberate scratch, the same 8-line Pinkerton symbol from the map, was a metal strongbox. Ruth crouched down and lifted the board. The box was there, exactly as Jim had left it. She could see even in the low light that it was undisturbed. No scratches on the lock. No signs that anyone had found it or tried to open it. She picked it up. It was heavier than she expected. The key, Shaw said quietly. She reached into her collar again. Beside the seam where the map had been, she'd found something else when she unpicked the stitching that evening. A small brass key, sewn into the lining separately, so small she'd almost missed it. She'd taken it out and put it in her boot. She retrieved it now and fitted it to the lock. It turned. Inside the strongbox were two things. The first was money. A great deal of money, stacked neatly, bound with paper strips, the kind of organized packing that spoke of someone who'd had time to prepare carefully. She didn't count it. She didn't need to right now. The second was a ledger, leather-bound, well-worn, the cover soft from years of handling. She lifted it out and held it in both hands for a moment before opening it. The handwriting inside was Jim's. She knew it immediately. The slight leftward lean, the way he formed his sevens with a cross stroke, the particular shape of his capital B, the two loops made separately rather than in one stroke. She knew this handwriting the way she knew the sound of his voice. Better, maybe. He'd written her letters when they were first married, before she moved to the farm, and she'd kept every one of them. She turned the pages slowly, names, dates, amounts, transactions, described in plain language, with the kind of precision that came from someone who understood exactly what he was documenting and why. 2 years of Harlan Briggs' hidden operations, laid out in careful detail. And at the back of the ledger, the last 3 pages were different. These weren't records. These were notes. Personal. Written in a different hand than the careful documentation that filled the rest of the book. The same handwriting, different in tone. Faster, less controlled. The writing of someone who was tired and running out of time. She turned to the last page. At the bottom, below several paragraphs she would read fully later, were 2 lines. Ruth, if you found this, then you already know more than I wanted you to. I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to tell you sooner. The truth is, I didn't trust myself. I was afraid you'd see what I'd been and not be able to see what I became. You were always the best thing I ever did. Take care of the farm. She read it twice. Then she closed the ledger and held it against her chest for a moment in the darkness of the shed, with the lantern burning low and the sound of the horses outside and the vast quiet of the Texas night all around her. Shaw stood near the door and did not look at her. He gave her that, the privacy of it. After a while, she said, "He kept a copy." "What, Jim?" She opened the ledger to the inside front cover, where a small note was pasted. She'd almost missed it. Sent a copy of the ledger to the Pinkerton office in Kansas City. Before he died, he wrote it here. The date, the address, the contents. Shaw came forward and looked at the note. "He sent it," he said slowly, "but Pinkerton never acted on it. Either it didn't arrive," Ruth said, "or it arrived and got buried, or someone in the Kansas City office was paid to lose it." They looked at each other. "We need the original," Shaw said. "The copy he sent may or may not still exist. But this," he nodded at the ledger in her hands, "this is the evidence. This is what Briggs has been looking for." "Then we take it back to town," Ruth said. "It won't be safe. Once Briggs knows his men didn't come back." "I know," she said, "but Briggs has spent 15 years being safe, being careful, being the man everyone in Redstone respects." She closed the strongbox. "We take this back and we don't give him time to be careful." She stood up, the ledger under one arm and the strongbox in her other hand. "One more thing," Shaw said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded document, old, official-looking, creased from long carrying. "I've had this for 7 years. I was waiting until I had something to attach it to." She looked at it, a formal letter. Pinkerton National Detective Agency, Kansas City, dated. It was a field authorization. A document confirming that an operative designated JC7 was working under official Pinkerton sanction in connection with the Abilene investigation. JC7 Jim Calloway. He was officially sanctioned, Ruth said. Everything he did. He was acting under Pinkerton authority, which means, Shaw said, that what happened to your farm, and what happened to my wife, and what happened to Jim, all of it traces back to a man who interfered with a federal investigation and ordered the deaths of people working under legal protection. "That's not just a county matter," Ruth said. No, Shaw said. It isn't. They started back as the sky was beginning to lighten in the east, that particular blue-gray that comes before the actual color of dawn. The sky not quite dark anymore, not yet light, as though it was still deciding. Ruth rode with the ledger inside her coat, against her skin, where she could feel it. She thought about Jim. She'd spent 3 years missing him in the ordinary way. Missing the sound of him in the kitchen in the morning. Missing his presence at the table at dinner. Missing the particular quality of not being alone that you only understand fully when you are. She'd grieved him honestly, and then she'd gotten on with things, because that was the only option available. But she hadn't grieved this. She hadn't been able to, because she hadn't known it existed, the man he'd been before she met him. The choices he'd made and the consequences he'd run from, and the weight he'd carried quietly for 20 years in a house she thought she knew completely. The part of himself he'd kept separate, whether to protect her, or to protect himself, or because he genuinely didn't know how to give it words. She wasn't sure she was angry. She thought she might be, eventually. There was something there that would need to become anger before it could become anything else. But right now it was just weight. The feeling of something large settling into a new shape inside her. She had loved him. She still did. You didn't stop loving someone because you learned they'd kept things from you. But it was more complicated now, more textured. The way a thing becomes more real when it stops being simple. Can I ask you something? Shaw said beside her in the growing light. Yes, the exhibition, he said. Buffalo Bill's Wild West. You said you performed for 10 years, from 1859 to 1869. I was 17 when I joined. How does a 17-year-old girl end up as a featured sharpshooter in a Wild West exhibition? She was quiet for a moment. My father was a hunter, she said. He had 4 daughters and no sons, which he considered a design flaw in the universe. So he taught us all to shoot, she paused. I turned out to be considerably better at it than he expected. Better than him? By the time I was 14, yes. He was proud and horrified in equal measure. Shaw made a sound that might have been a laugh. A quiet one. The exhibition came through our town when I was 16, she said. I watched the shooting demonstration and I thought, I can do that, better than that. So I went backstage afterward and I said so. What happened? They laughed at me, she said, the first time. The second time I came back, they gave me a gun and a target and stopped laughing fairly quickly. She could still remember that moment. Standing in the field behind the exhibition grounds, smell of gunpowder and summer grass, and the silence after the shots when the men around her had simply stopped talking. It was the first time she'd understood what she was. And you left it, Shaw said. For Jim, for a life, she said. The exhibition was, she thought about how to say it. It was extraordinary, and it was exhausting, and it was lonely in a way that's hard to describe. You're always moving, you're always performing, you're always someone's spectacle. She looked at the road ahead. Jim offered me something that stayed in one place. That was mine. That grew, and now? Now the farm is still there, she said. It still needs working. That hasn't changed. They rode in silence for a while. The sky was turning pink at the edges. When we get back, Shaw said, Briggs will know something went wrong. He may already, I know. He'll move quickly. Men like Briggs, they have contingencies. He's had 15 years to build them. I know that too. We need Pruitt, Shaw said. I don't love that answer. But we do. Without the sheriff, we have a ledger and a story. With the sheriff, we have a legal proceeding. Pruitt was afraid of Briggs. Ruth said, Yes, he's been afraid for a long time. Yes, fear like that. She paused. It changes a man. He might not come back from it even if we give him a reason to. Maybe, Shaw said. But I've found that most people, given a genuine opportunity to do the right thing, take it. They've been waiting for the opportunity. The fear isn't about the rightness of the choice. It's about the cost. And what do we offer him that makes the cost bearable? The truth, Shaw said, and the knowledge that this is his last chance to be on the right side of it. Ruth thought about that. The farm came into view in the distance. Not her farm, just the roofline of a neighboring property she recognized. They were maybe 4 miles from Redstone now. The sky was fully lightening. He has a name, she said, in Jim's ledger. I saw it when I was turning pages. Pruitt, once. An entry from 12 years ago. Briggs paid him. But enough. For what? I don't know yet. I didn't read it fully. She glanced at him. But if Briggs paid him, Briggs has a record of it too. Briggs keeps everything, I'd guess. Men like that always do. It's how they maintain control. And Pruitt knows that, Shaw said. He knows that whatever Briggs has on him is sitting in a file somewhere, which means he's never been free. Not for 12 years. Showing him the ledger shows him that Briggs's records go both ways. Shaw said yes, and that the only way out from under this is through it. Ruth nodded slowly. All right, she said. Pruitt first. Then Briggs. They came back into Redstone as the town was waking up. It was early enough that the streets were mostly empty. A merchant opening his shutters, a woman drawing water from the well near the church, 2 men loading a wagon outside the feed store. Normal morning. Quiet town. No sign yet that anything had changed. But Ruth knew it had. She could feel it in the quality of the air, which was probably imagination, but also probably wasn't. 20 years in one place teaches you its texture. And this morning Redstone felt like a held breath. They tied their horses at the rail outside the sheriff's office and went in. Pruitt was already there. He was sitting behind his desk with a cold cup of coffee and the look of a man who hadn't slept. When they came through the door, he looked up. Something complicated moved across his face. Relief and dread arose simultaneously. Ruth, he said. Then looking at Shaw, who are you? Everett Shaw. Former Pinkerton. Pruitt's eyes moved back to Ruth. You didn't come home last night, he said. No, she said. The dusty spur. He stopped. You already know, she said. Gus Lorne came to me at 2 in the morning, Pruitt said. He told me there'd been. He stopped again. He said Wade Creel and 3 others. Wade is alive, Shaw said. Shoulder wound. He needs a doctor. Pruitt looked at Ruth. She could see him trying to fit what he was looking at. A woman he'd known for 20 years, a woman who sold eggs at the market and nodded at him in church, into what he'd been told had happened in that storage room. Ruth, Desmond, she said. She sat down across from him and put the ledger on the desk between them. He looked at it. Jim kept records, she said. Everything, 2 years of Harlan Briggs's operations. Every payment, every name, every transaction. All of it. Pruitt didn't touch the ledger. That's a serious thing, he said quietly. Your name is in it, she said. Once. 12 years ago, the room was very still. Pruitt's face didn't change exactly, but something behind it did. Something that had been held tightly for a long time loosened just slightly, like a rope under tension when one strand gives. I know what you've been carrying, she said. I don't know the details, but I know it's been heavy, and I know that Briggs has made sure you couldn't set it down. Pruitt looked at the desk. It was a mistake, he said, very quietly, 12 years ago. I made a mistake and he knew about it, and he made it very clear what would happen if I didn't. He stopped. A man doesn't always see at the time that he's trading one trouble for a worse one. No, Ruth said. He doesn't, and then one day he looks up and 12 years have gone by. Yes. Pruitt was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the desk and touched the edge of the ledger. Not opening it, just touching it. If I help you, he said. What happens to me? Shaw leaned forward. You cooperate fully, you testify. You document everything Briggs has asked of you in the last 12 years. You do it completely and you do it honestly. He paused. I still have contacts at Pinkerton and in the federal marshal's office. A cooperative witness in a case this size, a law enforcement officer who comes forward voluntarily. That carries weight. I'd lose the badge, Pruitt said. Yes, Shaw said. Probably. And the rest? I can't promise you anything specific, Shaw said. But I can tell you that I've seen what happens to the men who don't cooperate when cases like this unravel. This case will unravel, with or without you. The question is which side of it you're on. Pruitt looked at Ruth. She looked back at him steadily. Desmond, she said, Jim is gone. I can't ask him what he'd want. But I knew him 20 years, and I think he'd say that every man gets at least one chance to choose clearly. This is yours. The sheriff sat with that for a long moment. Outside, Redstone was fully awake now. They could hear it. Wheels on the street, voices at a distance, the ordinary sounds of a town that didn't know yet what was sitting in the sheriff's office. Pruitt picked up the ledger. He opened it to the first page and read the first entry. He read for a while without speaking. Then he sat down, stood up, and took his hat from the hook on the wall. Briggs will be at the council chambers at 9 o'clock, he said. He has a standing meeting with the land office on Thursday mornings. He's been doing it for years. He put his hat on. That gives us about an hour. He looked at Ruth. I know where he keeps his private records, he said. The ones he uses to keep people in line. If we move now before he knows what's happened, then we take them, Shaw said. And then Ruth said, we finish this. Pruitt nodded. He looked older than he had when they'd walked in, but also somehow lighter. Let's go, he said. The council chambers were on the north end of Main Street, a solid brick building, 2 stories, with the kind of permanent, settled look that money and time produced together. Harlan Briggs had overseen its construction himself 12 years ago. He donated a third of the cost personally and made sure everyone in Redstone knew it. That was how he operated. You built things people needed. You put your name on them quietly. You let the gratitude accumulate over years until it became something thicker than gratitude. Something closer to loyalty, or at least to the assumption of your goodness. Pruitt led them around to the back entrance. He had a key. Of course he had a key. He'd had one for 10 years, kept on the same ring as his office key and his house key, carried every day like it was ordinary. He'd never once used it for anything except what Briggs wanted. The back corridor was dim and smelled of old paper and lamp oil. Pruitt moved through it with the certainty of someone who'd walked it many times. Past the main council room, past a storage closet, to a door at the far end that looked like another storage closet. It wasn't. Pruitt produced a second key, smaller, and opened it. Inside was a narrow room. A desk, a lamp, 3 filing cabinets along the wall. No window. He calls it his working room, Pruitt said. Nobody else has been in here. As far as I know, how do you have a key? Shaw asked. He gave it to me 4 years ago, in case he ever needed documents retrieved without coming himself. Pruitt's voice was flat. I understood what that meant. I didn't ask questions. Ruth walked to the filing cabinets. First drawer was organized with a precision that spoke of someone who trusted no one else to do his filing. Every folder labeled, dated, cross-referenced. Financial records, land transactions, correspondence with the county seat and the state capital. The second drawer was different, fewer folders, thicker, each one labeled with a single name. She found Pruitt's folder. She didn't open it. That was his business, not hers. She simply noted it and moved on. She found 3 other names she recognized. Judge in the county seat, a land commissioner, a man who ran the largest cattle operation in the region and sat on the state agricultural board, and at the back of the drawer a folder labeled simply, Callaway. She took it out. Inside was a collection of documents spanning more than a decade. Correspondence tracing Jim's movements after he disappeared from Briggs's operation. Reports from men Briggs had hired to find him. A gap of several years. The period when Jim had successfully hidden. Then a single sheet dated 3 years ago with an address, the Callaway Farm. Redstone, Texas, below the handrace, 2 words in Briggs' neat handwriting confirmed. Proceed. Ruth read those 2 words twice. Then she put the folder under her arm with Jim's ledger. Take everything with a name on it, Shaw said quietly from behind her. He was looking through the 3rd cabinet, every individual file. We don't leave anything he can use. They worked quickly. 10 minutes, maybe less. Shaw found what he'd been looking for in the bottom drawer of the 3rd cabinet, a separate ledger, Briggs's own, covering the same period as Jim's but from the other side. The payments made, the instructions given, the names of every man who'd done work for him that wasn't on any official record. He held it up briefly. Ruth nodded. They left the room exactly as they'd found it, except for what they'd taken. In the corridor, Pruitt locked the door behind them, stood for a moment with his hand still on the key. Then he took it off his ring and set it on the floor outside the door. Neither Ruth nor Shaw said anything about that. They didn't need to. They went back out the way they'd come in. Outside, the morning was fully bright now. The sky was clear and blue and the kind of crisp that October brought to this part of Texas. Not cold exactly, but honest. He'll be here in 20 minutes, Pruitt said, looking at the front of the building. Then we should be ready, Shaw said, but they weren't, because Harlan Briggs was already there. He was standing on the steps of the council chambers when they came around the corner, not alone. He had 2 men with him. Not Wade's men, different men. Broader, calmer. And behind him, already gathering on the street, were people. A lot of people. Ruth stopped walking. She understood immediately what she was looking at. Briggs had moved faster than they'd expected. He hadn't waited for word from Wade. He'd made his own assessment of the situation sometime before dawn. Perhaps when Gus Lorne came to him, perhaps earlier. And he'd decided on his response. He was going to do this publicly. He stood on those steps in his best suit, silver-haired and composed, the comfortable authority of a man who'd stood in front of crowds his whole life and knew exactly how to use one. Mrs. Callaway, his voice carried easily across the street. Calm, regretful. The voice of a man performing reluctance. People on the street turned to look. There were 30-40 of them. Merchants, farmers, women with market baskets, old men who sat on benches and watched the town go about its business. The ordinary population of an ordinary Thursday morning. Ruth stood still. She looked at Briggs on his steps. She looked at the crowd. She looked at Shaw beside her and Pruitt slightly behind. Pruitt had gone pale. I had hoped, Briggs said, addressing the crowd as much as Ruth, that this morning would not come. I had hoped that the matter could be resolved privately with dignity, as befits a community that values its good name. He paused, but events have overtaken that hope. And I believe this town deserves to know the truth. He was good at this. Ruth had to give him that. Very good at this. Last night, 4 men were killed in the Dusty Spur Saloon. Men who were, I can tell you now, employed by me. Employed to recover documents that were stolen from this office 7 years ago by a man named James Calloway, who many of you knew as a farmer and a neighbor. A murmur through the crowd. James Calloway was not who he appeared to be. He was a man who worked briefly in my financial operations, legitimately, lawfully, and who, when his employment ended, chose to take proprietary documents and a significant sum of money that did not belong to him. He fled. He spent years hiding, and when my representatives finally located him and attempted to negotiate a private return of what was taken, Briggs paused. He died, conveniently, before anything could be settled, and now he continued, his voice carrying that practiced note of sorrow. His widow, who has clearly known about these stolen materials all along, has taken the lives of 4 men who were acting under my lawful direction to recover them. She has done this with the assistance of a man named Shaw, a disgraced former Pinkerton agent who was dismissed for unauthorized conduct 7 years ago and who has, apparently, been pursuing a personal vendetta against me ever since. He let that sit for a moment. The crowd was very quiet now. The quiet of people absorbing something that didn't fit their picture of the world. Ruth knew some of these people's names. She knew their children. She'd sold eggs to half of them. She knew what Briggs was doing. He was using their knowledge of her, their ordinary, comfortable knowledge of Ruth Calloway, who sold eggs and kept a tidy farm, against her. He was placing that ordinary woman inside a story that made her something dangerous and hidden, and the terrible thing about it was that part of it was true. She was dangerous. She had been hidden, not in the way he meant, but the truth had enough shape in common with his version that it could confuse people who didn't know the rest of it. Shaw stepped forward. "Don't," Ruth said quietly. He looked at her. "Let me," she said. She stepped forward alone. She walked to the center of the street, not to the steps where Briggs stood. To the middle, the open space where everyone could see her, and where she could see all of them. She didn't raise her voice more than she needed to. The morning was still and sound carried. "My name is Ruth Calloway," she said. "Most of you know me. I've been selling eggs at this market for 20 years. My husband Jim and I have been your neighbors for longer than some of your children have been alive." She paused, not for effect, just to let that land. "Last night I went to the Dusty Spur because 4 men threatened to burn my farm if I didn't. They wanted something Jim left behind. And when those men followed me into the back of that building, I defended myself." A woman near the front of the crowd, Mrs. Alderman, whose hip gave her trouble, was looking at Ruth with an expression she couldn't quite read. "I want to tell you who I was before I came to Redstone," Ruth said, "because Mr. Briggs is right that I've been something other than what I appeared. Not in the way he means, but the skill he's counting on you not knowing about, that's real." She looked out at the faces. "From 1859 to 1869, I was the featured sharpshooter of a traveling Wild West exhibition. For 5 of those years, I was the headline act. I performed across this country for audiences of thousands of people. And the skill I built during those years," she stopped. "I never lost it. I only stopped using it publicly." "She's admitting to the killings," Briggs said from his steps. "Smooth, practiced. She's telling you herself." "I'm telling you what happened," Ruth said without looking at him. "And why. Those are different things." She reached into her coat and held up the ledger. "This is my husband's record. 2 years of documentation. Every payment Harlan Briggs made. Every name of every person who worked in his criminal operation. Every transaction that moved stolen money into legitimate business." She held it steady. "Jim Calloway kept this record because he was working under Pinkerton agency authorization. He was an operative, and when Briggs discovered he was a threat, Briggs had him killed." The crowd murmur changed, not louder. "Deeper. Jim didn't die of illness," she said. "He was poisoned." Slowly, carefully, in a way that looked like sickness to everyone including me, she looked at the street in front of her. "I didn't know that until last night. I have spent 3 years believing my husband died in his bed of natural causes. Learning otherwise is..." She stopped. "It is what it is. I'm telling you because you deserve to know why I did what I did. And because the man standing on those steps is counting on you not knowing." She looked at Briggs now directly. "You told this town that Jim was a thief," she said. "Jim was a man who made mistakes and spent the rest of his life trying to set them right. The record he kept, the evidence he preserved, that was his attempt at setting things right. He didn't get to finish it, so I finished it for him." Briggs came down 1 step. His composure was still there. "But it was working harder now. This is a very compelling story," he said. "But a story is all it is. A widow's grief and a disgraced detective's grievance, dressed up as..." Desmond, Ruth said it quietly, not loudly. But in the stillness of the square it carried, Pruitt walked forward from where he'd been standing. He walked slowly, like a man carrying something he'd been carrying too long. He came to stand beside Ruth in the middle of the street, and he faced the crowd. He took his badge off his coat. He looked at it for a moment. Then he held it in his hand at his side. "I have been sheriff of Redstone for 14 years, he said, "and for 12 of those years I have done what Harlan Briggs told me to do. Not because I wanted to. Because he knew something about me and he made sure I understood the cost of refusing." The square was absolutely silent. "I am not going to tell you that excuse is what I did. It doesn't. But I am going to tell you that what Ruth Calloway has told you this morning is the truth. I know it because I have seen the evidence with my own eyes. And because I have been part of what Briggs built here, and I know what it looks like from the inside." He looked up at Briggs. "It's over, Harlan." Briggs stood on his step. For the first time that morning, something cracked in his composure. Not widely, just at the edges. A tightening around the eyes that spoke of a man rapidly recalculating. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Pruitt. He looked at Ruth. And then he looked past her to somewhere at the edge of the square. Ruth turned. Wade Creel was standing at the mouth of the alley between the land office and the millinery shop. His left arm was in an improvised sling, cloth torn from something, tied roughly. His right hand was free. He was looking at Ruth. She'd known he might come back, consciously. But somewhere underneath the conscious part, she'd known. A man like Wade didn't simply accept being bested. It wasn't in his construction. It was a question of identity for men like him, losing, especially losing the way he'd lost, to a woman with a market basket, required a response. She'd known. She'd been tracking the edges of the crowd all morning. With the part of her attention she kept quiet and separate. The part that had never really switched off, not even in 20 years of farming. It was the part that watched exits and angles in the behavior of people at the periphery. The part built by 10 years of performing in front of large, unpredictable audiences where anything could happen, and you were the one responsible for managing it. She'd been watching the alleys, so when Wade appeared, she was already turning. He wasn't going to give a speech. That wasn't his style. He was a practical man, in his way. He'd lost, he'd been hurt, and now he was going to settle the account and leave. Simple. His right hand moved toward the holster at his hip. The distance was about 40 feet. 40 feet was nothing. She'd made shots at 200 yards in wind conditions that would have stopped most shooters. She'd split playing cards edge on at 100. She'd shot the flame off a candle from the length of a city block while riding a horse at a canter, and the crowd had thought it was a trick until they saw the candle was still standing. 40 feet was nothing. But there were people in the way. That was the thing. The square was full of people, and they'd started to move when Wade appeared. Some toward him, some away. The instinctive, confused motion of a crowd that doesn't know yet which direction danger is coming from. She had about 2 seconds before someone walked into her line. She didn't draw from the basket. She'd put the pistol in her coat pocket when they left the council building. Her hand was already there, had been there since she'd seen Wade at the alley mouth, because she'd understood before her mind had fully articulated it. She drew. She read the movement of the crowd the way she'd read audiences for years, predicting the path of motion, identifying the gap, calculating the fraction of a second when the line would be clear. Wade's gun was coming up. The gap opened. One shot caught Wade's pistol at the frame, just above the grip, and sent it spinning out of his hand and across the dirt of the square. The sound of metal on metal rang out sharp and clear across the silence. Wade stood with his empty hand raised, staring at it. Then he sat down heavily on the ground. Not from injury. From the simple, overwhelming fact of what had just happened, the square was utterly still. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. 40 or 50 people standing in the morning sunlight, looking at the woman in the worn farm clothes standing in the middle of Main Street with a pistol still level. Ruth lowered the gun. She put it back in her pocket. She turned to look at Briggs. He was still on his step. 2 men had stepped back from him. Not dramatically, not obviously, but a few inches, the unconscious distancing of people reconsidering their associations. Briggs looked at Ruth. He looked at the crowd. He looked at Pruitt. He looked like a man watching the architecture of 15 years dismantle itself in front of him. All the favors owed, all the fear maintained, all the careful, patient construction of a reputation that made him untouchable. Going, all of it going. Harlan Briggs, Pruitt said, and his voice was steadier than it had been all morning. He walked toward the steps. "I am placing you under arrest for conspiracy, extortion, fraud, and the murder of James Calloway." He paused. For whatever a federal judge decides to add to that list when he sees what's in those files. Briggs looked at him for a long moment. Then, very carefully, he sat down on the step. He didn't run. He didn't fight. He sat down like a man who understood, finally and completely, that there was nowhere to go. "I'll want my lawyer," he said. "You'll have him," Pruitt said. After he put the handcuffs on, Shaw came to stand beside Ruth. He didn't say anything immediately. He looked at where Wade was sitting in the dirt of the square, his empty hands still slightly raised, staring at nothing. He looked at the crowd beginning to move and murmur again, the way a crowd does when the extraordinary moment passes and ordinary human noise rushes back in. Then he looked at Ruth. "The candle flame," he said quietly. "At 100 yards, city block," she said, and it was a full candle. Not a flame, of course it was. She put the ledger under her arm more firmly and watched Pruitt lead Harlan Briggs across the square toward the sheriff's office. Briggs walked steadily, unhurried. The composure of a man who'd made his calculation and found his position. At the edge of the square, he stopped and turned to look back at Ruth. "Your husband," he said. Not loudly, just enough to carry to her across the distance. She looked at him. "The order to proceed," he said. "It was not what you think." "Then tell me what it was," she said. "Not here," he said, "and not like this." He looked at her steadily. "Ask your Mr. Shaw what a Pinkerton operative does when a case goes wrong and the agency needs the problem to disappear quietly." Pruitt moved him forward. They went. Ruth stood in the square and felt the morning sunlight on her face and thought about what Briggs had just said. She didn't look at Shaw. Not yet. The rest of the day moved slowly, the way days do after extraordinary things. Pruitt sent a telegraph to the federal marshal's office in Austin before noon. Shaw helped him draft it, precise, specific, citing the Pinkerton authorization documents and the chain of evidence. Within 2 hours, a reply had come back confirming that a marshal would arrive within 3 days. Wade Creel was moved from the square to a cell. He didn't speak. He sat on the cot and looked at the wall with the expression of a man who'd run out of moves, and was only now understanding what that meant. 3 surviving men from the storage room, who'd been locked in the back room of the sheriff's office since morning, were formally charged. They talked quickly, the way men do when they understand that the person they were protecting is no longer in a position to protect them. The judge in the county seat, whose name appeared in Briggs's private files, was contacted by telegraph and informed that his association with Briggs was a matter of documented record. His response was not to resign immediately, but to become suddenly and entirely cooperative with the investigation, which amounted to the same thing. Ruth sat in Pruitt's office for most of the afternoon, going through the documents they'd taken from Briggs's hidden room. Shaw sat across from her. Pruitt came in and out, handling the steady stream of people and decisions that came with a morning like the one they'd had. The town was unsettled in the way that towns become unsettled when something they'd accepted as permanent turns out not to have been. Not chaotic, not hostile, just recalibrating. The Josu shape of things. Mrs. Alderman came by in the afternoon, knocked on the door, and left a covered dish of food without saying much. Just looked at Ruth with those eyes that Ruth still couldn't quite read and patted her hand once and went away. Ruth ate the food because she hadn't eaten since the night before, and her body insisted on the ordinary, even when her mind was elsewhere. She'd been thinking about what Briggs had said in the square. Ask your Mr. Shaw what a Pinkerton operative does when a case goes wrong. She'd been sitting with it all morning, fitting it against what she knew, what Jim had written, what Shaw had told her, looking for where the pieces didn't align. It was one place, one small place where the story had a gap she hadn't examined. Shaw had told her that Jim sent a copy of the ledger to the Pinkerton office in Kansas City before he died, and that the copy had never resulted in any action, either lost or buried, or someone paid to ignore it. But Jim had been a Pinkerton operative. He would have known the Kansas City office well. He would have known who to trust and who not to trust. He was a careful man. He wouldn't have sent his only insurance to an address he wasn't certain of, which meant either the copy had genuinely been lost or it had arrived, and someone had made sure nothing happened. She looked up from the documents. Shaw was reading through Briggs's private ledger, making notes in the small notebook he carried. He looked focused, professional. The manner of a man doing the work he'd been trained to do. She'd trusted him, she realized. She'd trusted him quickly, instinctively, in the way you sometimes trust people when the circumstances are extreme and the need is immediate and there isn't time to be careful. She'd trusted him with Jim's documents, with the key, with the location of the strongbox. She'd trusted him because he'd followed her into a dark room when he didn't know what he was following her into. Because he'd stood in a doorway and looked at what she'd done and not flinched. Because he'd given her the privacy of her grief over Jim's letter without being asked. Those were real things. She didn't dismiss them, but she also thought about what Briggs had said. She thought about it carefully. Then she put down the document she was reading and said, he looked up. Jim's copy. The one he sent to Kansas City? Yes? You said it might have been buried. Someone paid to lose it, it's possible. Or someone in the Kansas City office received it and made a decision, she said. Decision about what to do with a case that had become complicated. An operative who'd run. A case that was officially closed. Shaw looked at her. Briggs said something to me in the square, she said. He said to ask you what happens when a Pinkerton case goes wrong and the agency needs the problem to disappear. The room was quiet. Shaw set down his pen. He was trying to create doubt, Shaw said. Briggs is very good at creating doubt. It's how he operates. You give someone a partial truth and let their imagination fill in the rest, I know, Ruth said. So tell me the part that's true. Shaw was quiet for a moment. Then he said, when I was at Pinkerton, in the last months before I left, I was assigned to the case review board, briefly. Cases that had gone cold, operatives who'd gone dark, files that needed closing. Ruth waited. Jim's file came across my desk, Shaw said. 3 months before my wife died. I reviewed it, saw that he'd gone dark, that his contact had been compromised, that he hadn't been heard from. He paused. The standard procedure, when an operative had gone dark for more than a year and the case was compromised, was to close the file. Mark the operative as inactive, and you closed it, Ruth said. I closed it, he said. Yes. The afternoon light came through the office window and lay across the desk between them. I didn't know where he was, Shaw said. I didn't know he'd built a life somewhere. I didn't know about you or the farm or any of it. I just saw a file for an operative who'd gone dark in a compromised case, and I did what procedure required, and the copy he sent to Kansas City. I don't know if it ever arrived, Shaw said, genuinely. If it arrived after I'd already closed the file, it may have been misrouted. Filed with inactive cases. Bureaucracies lose things, especially when nobody's looking for them. Ruth looked at him for a long time. But when you left Pinkerton, she said slowly, and you started looking into Briggs, you had Jim's file. You knew his code name, JC7, and you knew that JC7 had been a Pinkerton operative in Briggs's organization. Yes. So when you sat down in that saloon last night, she said, and you heard me say the name Jim Calloway, you weren't surprised in the way a stranger would be surprised. Shaw met her eyes. No, he said. I wasn't. Ruth absorbed that. She thought about the moment in the saloon when she'd said Jim's name and watched something settle into place behind Shaw's expression. She'd read it as recognition. She'd been right about that. She just hadn't known the full shape of the recognition. You came to Redstone looking for Briggs, she said. But you also knew, somewhere in what you knew, that JC7 had settled somewhere, that there was a farm. A widow. I didn't know it was here, Shaw said. I didn't know it was you. I came to Redstone following Briggs, not following Jim. He looked at the desk. But when I sat down in that saloon and I watched those men watching the door, and then I watched you walk in, I understood. Yes, I understood what I was looking at. Why didn't you tell me? Because, he said, I didn't know how. Because what I had to tell you was that I closed the file. That I may have, through procedure, through bureaucratic correctness, failed to protect a man who needed protecting. A man who sent evidence to my office and received nothing in return. He stopped. I didn't know how to sit across from his widow and say that before she'd had any reason to trust me. The room was quiet. Outside, the town went on with its afternoon. Ruth looked at the ledger on the desk. At Jim's handwriting visible through the open cover. 20 years of a life she'd thought she'd known completely, and was only now beginning to understand fully. She thought about what Shaw had said the night before, on the road back from the Hadley place. Most people, given a genuine opportunity to do the right thing, take it. They've been waiting for the opportunity. She thought about Pruitt walking forward in the square. Badge in hand, she thought about Jim, stitching a key into a coat lining in the last days of his life, making sure the thing he'd built would survive him. He thought about the 5 years she'd spent on stages across this country, performing something that people called a trick because they couldn't believe it was real. She thought about what Jim had said when he first watched her shoot. Lord, Ruth, who are you? And what she'd said back, just a farmer's wife, and what he'd said no. You're something else entirely. She looked at Shaw. You should have told me, she said. You should have told me last night. Yes, he said, I should have. You should have told me, she said. You should have told me last night. Yes, he said, I should have. She was quiet for a moment. Outside, a wagon went by on the street, ordinary sound. Ordinary afternoon. Jim kept things from me for 20 years, she said finally. He thought he was protecting me. He was wrong about that. But I understood why he did it. I didn't agree with it. But I understood it. She looked at Shaw directly. I'm not going to hold you to a higher standard than I held him. But I'm also not going to pretend it didn't happen. That's fair, he said. Don't do it again, she said. Whatever comes next, I decide what I can handle. Not you. Understood, he said. And this time it meant something more specific, more earned. She reached across the desk and closed Jim's ledger. She looked at him for another moment. Then she reached across the desk and closed Jim's ledger. She set it squarely in the center of the desk and put her hands flat on the cover. Jim made mistakes, she said. He carried them and tried to set them right and ran out of time. You made a mistake. Pruitt made mistakes and carried them longer than he should have. She looked at the ledger. The thing about mistakes is they're not the end of the story unless you decide they are. Shaw said nothing. Jim decided they weren't the end, she said. Spent 11 years building something true. And in the end he made sure the truth survived him. She looked up. That's what I'm going to remember, not the mistakes. What he did with them, the afternoon light had shifted. It came lower through the window now, the long gold light of late October that made ordinary things look significant. Pruitt came back in. He looked at both of them and read the quality of the silence correctly. Marshall arrives in 3 days, he said. He set his hat on the hook by the door. Briggs has lawyered up as expected. His lawyer is riding from the county seat, won't be here until tomorrow at the earliest. He sat down heavily in his chair. Wade Creel started talking. Some of it's useful, how much? Shaw asked. Enough. Pruitt looked at the ledger. Combined with what Jim left behind. It'll be enough. Ruth stood up. She picked up her coat from the back of the chair and put it on. I'm going home, she said. The farm doesn't stop needing attention because the rest of this happened. It's late in the day, Shaw said. The road. I know the road, she said. I've ridden it for 20 years. She looked at him. There are things that need doing. The chickens need feeding and the water trough needs checking, and the north fence has needed mending since February. She looked at Pruitt. Thank you, Desmond, she said. For this morning, Pruitt looked at the badge sitting on the edge of his desk. He hadn't put it back on. I don't know what comes next, he said. For me, you did the right thing, she said. That's a start. She walked to the door. Behind her, she heard the scrape of a chair. I'll ride with you, Shaw said. If that's all right. She paused in the doorway. The late afternoon light was behind her, coming through from the street. I told you, she said. The fence has needed mending since February. I can mend a fence, he said. She looked at him. He was standing with his hat in his hand. This man who'd spent 7 years following a shadow and had walked into a saloon on a Thursday evening and found the shadow had edges and a history in hands that could shoot the wings off a dragonfly at 60 paces. He looked like a man who'd been moving for a very long time and had possibly just noticed that he was tired. You'd have to work, she said. I don't keep people who don't work. That seems fair, he said. They walked out together into the afternoon. Redstone's main street was quieter now than it had been at mid-morning. The crowd had dispersed. The ordinary business of the day had resumed, or something approximating it. There was still a quality of disruption in the air, the unsettled sense of a town that had learned something about itself that morning, and was still deciding what to do with the knowledge. Ruth walked to the livery and collected her horse. Shaw collected his. They rode out of Redstone as the sun moved toward the hill country horizon. The road west was familiar and long. The light was the color of old copper, and it lay across the fields in wide, flat sheets, making even the dry grass look like something worth keeping. She didn't rush the horse. She'd been in a hurry since yesterday morning, and she was done with it for now. The urgency had been real, and the outcome had been what it needed to be, and now it was time to let things be as slow as they actually were. Can I ask you something? Shaw said after they'd ridden in silence for a while. You asked me that last night, she said. I'll keep asking until you tell me to stop. What is it? The first shot last night, he said. In the storage room. You made a decision in, I don't know, fraction of a second. Yes, were you afraid? She thought about the question honestly. No, she said. Not in the way you mean. She looked at the road. There's a kind of fear that freezes you. I've never had that kind. Even when I was 17 and performing in front of 2,000 people for the first time, I didn't freeze. What kind do you have? The kind that sharpens things, she said. Makes everything clear. The distances, the angles, the timing. She was quiet for a moment. Jim called it a gift. I always thought it was more of a characteristic, like the color of your eyes. You don't choose it, it's just what you are. Shaw nodded. They rode on. The farm appeared on the horizon, the roofline familiar against the sky. The barn, the house, chicken yard. 20 acres that asked only to be worked and gave back in proportion to what you put in. Jim said something to me once, Ruth said. We were having an ordinary evening. Nothing particular was happening. He was mending harness at the table and I was working on accounts, and he just looked up and said, she paused. He said, the best thing a person can do is build something that outlasts them. I asked him what he meant. He said he meant the farm, the soil, things we'd planted that would still be growing after we were gone. He meant the ledger too, Shaw said. I think so, she said. Yes. I think he was trying to tell me something he didn't know how to say directly. They reached the gate of the Calloway farm. Ruth dismounted and tied her horse to the post. The chickens in the yard were making their end-of-day sounds. The light was almost gone from the sky, just a thin orange line at the horizon. She stood for a moment looking at the farm, 20 years of her life, Jim's life, what they'd built here together still standing, still hers. She opened the gate. There's a cot in the barn, she said. If you want it, that'll do fine, Shaw said. She walked up to the house. The door was exactly as she'd left it, the kitchen exactly as it had been yesterday morning when she'd sat at this table and read a note left by people who'd underestimated her. She lit the lamp. She stood in her kitchen, in the house Jim had built with her, with the ledger still under her arm. She set it on the table. She'd read it fully later, all of it. Jim's records and Jim's notes and the last pages he'd written for her. She'd read it and she'd carry it, and it would become part of what she knew about her husband and about herself and about the particular way that truth has of surviving the people who hold it. But not tonight. Tonight she had chickens to feed and a fire to build and a farm that needed its keeper home. She hung up her coat and rolled up her sleeves, and she went to work.